Hello, this is Dan O'Connor. I'm a Chicago captain on the Schedule Research Committee at SWAP, and I'm here today to walk through the Reserve Proffer Process as agreed to in Contract 2020. As you remember, one of the primary goals in the scheduling area for Contract 2020 was to improve the quality of life for our reserve pilots. With 15 to 25% of our pilots being on reserve any given bid period, we felt it was important, and polling showed it was important to improve quality of life and flexibility. One of the aspects of that was giving the pilots a say in what their reserve assignment was going to be. Direction was given to insert more of a seniority aspect into the reserve proffering process. Today, we're going to go through the reserve proffering process as proposed and go through several examples to demonstrate how this would work. First of all, you have to remember that the reserve proffer process is used to assign pairings or training support events to pilots once scheduling has decided what is going to be assigned to reserves. This process is going to be used based on the seniority of pilots and the pilot proffering or bids as we think of them today. Some important points to remember before we walk through examples. There is no change to today's construction of the RCO, the Reserve Callout Order. It's still based by your category, RAPs remaining, your fly pass preference, month-to-date utilization with ties broken by seniority. So again, no change in Contract 2020 to how the RCO is constructed. Also, the company can still choose to premium or pop before assigning reserves. No change in this process either. Again, this process is only used once scheduling determines certain pairings or training support events are going to be assigned to reserves. All right, before we get into the steps of the RPP, Reserve Proffer Process, we need to talk first about a new concept for Contract 2020, and that's non-conforming pairings. Non-conforming pairings, by definition, are pairings that have a first duty period that does not legally fit into any RAP, AM, PM, or red eye. Think a pairing that reports at 10 a.m. local in your domicile and releases at 8 p.m. Obviously, this wouldn't fit to any of our standard AM or PM or red eye RAPs. Now, the company has the option to offer these to reserves, or other option would be to premium them, and they will only be awarded to pilots that put in a proffer for these pairings. In other words, a pilot cannot be forced to take a non-conforming pairing since they don't fit into their RAP. This will be the first step in the RPP, and they're actually assigned before the required fly list, RFL, which we'll talk about a little later, is created for the pairings that do fit into AM, PM, or red eye RAPs. Now, one caveat, and we're going to talk about this in the Reserve podcast, is to be awarded a non-conforming pairing, the number of duty periods in the pairing must match the number of RAPs remaining. In other words, you're on a 3-day reserve block, you can only be awarded a 3 duty period non-conforming pairing. That's because it triggers an automatic release to check-in, which we'll talk about in the other podcast. Another thing to remember is these non-conforming pairings are awarded by seniority regardless of what RAP you're actually in. In other words, if they have non-conforming pairings and a pilot chooses to proffer for those, they will be awarded in seniority order no matter what the pilot's underlying RAP is. All right, let's go through the reserve proffer process a little bit more detail. First step, like we just talked about, will be the assignment of non-conforming pairings. This happens, like we said, before the assignment of the pairings that do fit into a RAP. After that, a reserve fly list, RFL, will be created. These are reserve pilots that are designated for assignment derived from the RCO. Remember, the RCO construction is not changing from current day. So who is going to fly those reserve pairings does not change from the current day process. That's very important to remember. What does change is who is awarded what. As you know, right now, your only option is really to call and request what pairing you want if you're on reserve, or place a bid on it in open time and hope they'll notice. This actually gives the pilots a say, an orderly process for what they're assigned. So like I said, the reserves on the RFL will be assigned based on seniority and proffers within each bucket. And the assignments will start with the fewest remaining number of wraps and increasing. And again, we'll go through these examples so you see what I'm talking about. In other words, they're going to assign the 1 day, then the 2 day, then the 3 day, and so forth. And then the open time not assigned in a matching bucket will be placed successfully into the next higher bucket. This is the process they use today. If they decided they were going to award 3 2-day pairings or reserves and they only have 2 2-day reserves, that remaining 2 day would flow into the 3-day bucket. And again, the examples will go over this, but it's the current process. This RPP will run concurrently and close at the same time as dot and hot. In other words, while non-reserve pilots are placing their bids on the open time, reserve pilots will have the option to place a reserve proffer for the same pairings, and all will close at the same time. And then reserves, if they have chose to put in a proffer, will be considered in seniority order first. And then if you choose, or reserve pilots choose not to proffer, they will be assigned after those pilots that did choose to put in a proffer. Okay, since we're pilots and we all enjoy pictorials, let's move on. A little picture of the flow just to give a general view of how open time is going to work. So reserve, this is obviously with a focus on the reserve. The reserve pilot proffers, if they would like to, before the close for open time. Scheduling will, by contract, award the straight time awards to pilots that have bid straight on pairings, reserve blocks, or training support events. At this point, scheduling does have the option to premium or pop first, just like today. At that point, scheduling will designate which pairings or training support events will be assigned to reserves. At that point, scheduling will determine if they would like to offer, and they can at this point see if they have proffers on non-conforming assignments and award those, again in seniority order, disregarding what wrap the pilot was originally on. At that point, scheduling will make the required fly list pulled from the RCO, and obviously they will match the requirements to what open time they have chosen to assign to reserves. And then they'll go through the assignment process based on the proffers, starting with the shortest pairing length to the longest pairing length. Just as a reminder, reserve call-out order, there's no change at the construction in contract 2020. You're going to have 3 going forward, AM, PM, and red eye. More in the red eye wraps to follow in the reserve podcast. And the order of this, if you'll remember, is based on, for each category, reserve days, the month-to-date utilization, pass fly preference, with ties broken by seniority. All right, we're going to go through several examples. We're going to start with simple examples and work to more complicated examples. The way these examples are set up, we're going to explain what the situation is. In this case, we have 2 3 days, and we're going to call that pairing 3A and 3B, that scheduling has determined will be assigned to reserves. Then here is a simplified version of what we see in the reserve call-out order report. It's called the reserve report. Just for simplicity, we have seniority, the name, wraps remaining, utilization, and their preference. We won't go through here today how the RCO is constructed, but again, there's no change to that. This has been simplified just for demonstration purposes. So example 1, this is pretty straightforward. We have 3 pilots that have 3 wraps remaining in their reserve block. This would be the order based on their fly and pass preferences, and utilization, and they're going to cover 2 trips. Under RPP, the way this would work, the first 2 pilots are going to fly. Again, they're the first 2 on the RCO, so they're going to fly. RPP does not change that. They are pulled from the RCO into the RFL required fly list. Looking at their seniority, Lisa is 1. The seniority on Mark is 5. Lisa is more senior, so her proffer will be assessed first. She bid 3A then 3B. Because of that, Lisa is assigned 3A and Mark is assigned 3B. It doesn't actually matter if these are AM or PM. It would be either or. For this sake, we can call them AM. So 3A, pairing 3A goes to Lisa. She's more senior. 3B goes to Mark. And as we go here, we're going to move on to more and more complicated examples. Example 2, we have 1 3-day pairing. We'll call that pairing 3A. and multiple 4-day reserves. Step 1, now remember, they roll from bucket to bucket based on least to greatest number of duty periods. So there's no 3-day reserve, so the 3-day will roll into the 4-day bucket. There's only one uncovered pairing, 3A, and Brad is going to fly. He's first on the RCO. Remember, the RCO does not change. Brad is first on the RCO, and that's pulled into the RFL list. So regardless of whatever he proffered, 3A is going to be assigned to Brad. Important here to reminder, the RPP process does not determine who is going to fly, just what they are assigned. On to example 3. In this example, we have one 3-day, we'll call it pairing 3 alpha, and one 4-day pairing to be covered by a reserve assignment. So we have 3 alpha and 4B. That's a 3-day pairing and a 4-day pairing. We'll just consider all of these AM pairings for all these examples just for simplicity's sake. Again, here's your RCO. We have 3 4-day reserves. Stepping through this, because there's no 3-day reserves available, 3 rolls into the 4-day bucket. In the second step, since we have 2 uncovered pairings that are going to be assigned to reserves, we need 2 reserve pilots. Brad and Mike are the first 2 on the RCO, so they are pulled into the RFL. In the third step, let's just assume that both Brad and Mike proffer for the 4-day, 4B, followed by the 3A. So they both would like the 4-day first in their proffers. That's their first proffer. Their second proffer is 3A. If you look at the seniority, Brad is senior to Mike. He's 2 and Mike is 5. So Brad's proffer is processed first. Since they both wanted 4B first, Brad is assigned 4B and Mike is assigned 3 alpha. Example 4. After the straight open time has been awarded at the close, there are 2 pairings that need to be covered. A 1-day, a turn, 1 alpha, and a 3-day, we'll name 3 bravo. We have 1 4-day reserve and 2 3-day reserves. Now here, this is just a reminder, there's 2 options for scheduling. This is just to make the point. They can, at this point, decide to premium 1 alpha or assign it to the reserve. For this option, we're going to assume that scheduling has decided to assign the turn 1 alpha to one of the reserve pilots. How would this work? So 1A, the turn, is uncovered with no available 1 or 2-day reserves. Like we said before, crew scheduling may choose to pot 1A or roll it into the 3-day bucket. In this example, they chose not to pot the turn, but to assign it to a reserve. Therefore, we have 2 uncovered pairings. Since this is a 3-day and this rolls into a 2-day, no 2-day reserve, 3-day, they do have 3-day reserves, it goes into the 3-day bucket. So we need 2 pilots to go into the RFL from the 3-day bucket. So Brad and Mike are pulled into the RFL, required fly list. That's the smallest available bucket for those pairings. Brad is senior, therefore his proffer is processed first. Brad's proffer is 1A, the turn, followed by the 3-day, 3B. So he is assigned 1A, and Mike is assigned 3B. Just as a point, in that same example, with the same pairings and same reserve report, in this example, the crew scheduling has decided that they do not want to use a 3-day reserve for the turn 1A, so they decided to pot that turn. There was no straight bidders. And they decided to assign 3B to a reserve. Obviously, they only need 1 reserve from the RCO. Brad is first, so he will be assigned 3B. All right, moving on to the next example. Again, a little more complicated. In this example, the number of open time events is less than or equal to the reserves in each bucket. So this one's a pretty straightforward. It looks more complicated, but you'll see as we flow through this, it makes sense. So again, here is your reserve call-out order, and here are the uncovered pairings that scheduling has decided they will be assigning to reserves. We have 1 4-day, 2 3-days, a 2-day, and a turn. And we're going to go through these step by step. Some of these are fairly straightforward. Again, we start with the least number of duty periods. So the turn, there's only 1 1-day reserve. So Gabe is assigned the turn. Same thing with the 2-day. There's only 1 pilot, Mike, that has 2 wraps remaining. So Mike is assigned the 2-day, 2 alpha. Pretty straightforward. Now we have 2 3-days. So we needed to pull 2 3-day reserve pilots into the RFL, required fly list. Mark and Jessica are the first 2 on the RCO. So they are pulled in the RFL. Jessica, having a seniority of 3, is obviously more senior than Mark, have a seniority of 4. So her proffer is assessed first. We're going to assume that both of these pilots proffered for 3A first. So Jessica, because she is more senior, will be assigned 3 alpha, and Mark will be assigned 3 Bravo. Going up to the next number of high duty periods is 4. There's only one 4-day. Lisa is the first on the RCO for 4 days, so she's assigned 4 alpha. Didn't matter what she proffered for. There's only one 4-day. She's first on the list. She's going flying. She'll be assigned 4 alpha. Next example. Now we have more uncovered open time than reserves in a certain bucket. 1 turn, 2 2-days, 1 3-day, and 1 4-day. These are the uncovered pairings that scheduling has decided they will be assigning to reserve. Go through this step by step. In this case, as in the other one, there's 1 turn. Gabe is the only 1-day reserve, so Gabe is assigned 1 alpha. Now here's where it gets a little different from the last one. There's 2 2-day pairings, 2 alpha and 2 bravo, but only 1 2-day reserve. So Mike is going flying because there's 2 2-days and he's the only 2-day reserve. So Mike has proffered first for 2 alpha. So Mike is assigned 2 alpha. Since there's not another 2-day reserve to be assigned 2 bravo, 2 bravo rolls into the 3-day bucket. Remember, they always roll from 1 day to 2 day to 3 day to 4 days and so on. So 2 bravo rolls into the 3-day bucket. So now you have a 3-day and a 2-day that have to be covered by 3-day reserves. So since there's 2 in that bucket, Mark and Jessica are pulled into the fly list. And now their proffers are considered by seniority. Jessica is senior to Mark. Let's say that both of these pilots preferred 2 bravo to 3 alpha. But since Jessica's more senior, she is assigned 2 bravo and 3 alpha is assigned to Mark. For the 4-day 4 alpha, this is a little more simple. 1 4-day pairing. Lisa's first on the RCO. She's assigned 4 alpha. Next example. Now there's more uncovered open time than reserves in 2 different buckets. Again, we'll walk through this step by step. For this example, we have, these are separated because of how they're assigned, but if you look at it, we have 2 2-days, 2 alpha and 2 bravo, and then 3 3-days, 3 alpha, 3 bravo, and 3 Charlie. So 5 pairings, 2 2-days, and 3 3-days. So starting with the smallest bucket first, the 2 2-days, there's only 1 2-day reserve, Mike, and he proffered for 2A followed by 2B. So Mike gets his first proffer, 2 alpha, he's assigned 2 alpha. Now here is where this one's a little bit different than the last several. Although this process is actually the same process that's used today by scheduling to assign reserves. If you notice, there's 3 3-day pairings and 3 3-day reserves. Therefore, all 3 reserve pilots that are 3-day reserves are going to go fly. They're all pulled into the RFL. But since the number of 3-day pairings matches the number of 3-day reserves, they will be matched up 3 for 3. The buckets will be matched, and the 2-day that was not assigned to Mike, which is 2 bravo, will flow into the 4-day bucket. So just to go over that, since there are equal number of 3-day pairings and 3-day reserves, the 2 bravo rolls into the 4-day bucket. Mark, Jessica, and Dan are all pulled into the RFL for the 3 days, and the assignments are by seniority. If you notice this, Jessica is the most senior of the 3 days, followed by Mark and Dan. So they are assigned by seniority according to their proffers. Jessica, we're just going to make the assumptions how they did. Jessica was awarded her first choice 3 alpha, Mark 3 bravo, and then Dan 3 Charlie. But they are all assessed via their seniority for the 3 days. This leaves uncovered pairing 2 bravo. That flows into the 4-day buckets. Lisa's the first on the RCO for the 4 days, so she's assigned 2 bravo. This is actually the same process that scheduling uses today to assign reserves. This is for efficiency's sake. Okay, we've gone through several examples of how the RPP processes would work with buckets and so forth. There's a new process called voluntary double time, VDT, which will be covered more in the voluntary additional flying podcast. But a general overview of that process is before JA, junior assign, crew scheduling has to run the pairings through VDT, voluntary double time. The way that is going to work is that voluntary double time will be offered and awarded to non-reserve pilots first. After that process is complete, if no non-reserve pilots were awarded that VDT pairing, it will go first come, first serve to reserve pilots. These are unassigned reserve pilots that were not assigned during the RPP process. Just a couple of examples about VDT and how they associate with reserves. In this example, there are 3 2-day reserves and 1 3-day uncovered open time pairing. So again, 3 alpha is uncovered with no available 3 or 4-day bucket reserves to cover it. Now remember, before they split to cover this pairing or export it, it had to be run through premium. That's just a side note. It's a new process in Contract 2020. The goal there is to reduce or mitigate split to cover or exporting reserves just for the purpose of covering them. So before they either split to cover or export, crew scheduling required to award those premium. But let's say crew scheduling did not award a premium because there's no premium bidders. Before they split to cover, they can offer 3 alpha and voluntary double time. So like I mentioned before, and this will be covered more in depth in the voluntary additional flying podcast, first non-reserve pilots will have a crack at being awarded 3 alpha and VDT. But concurrent to that process, at the same time, reserve pilots who are not assigned can place a bid on that VDT. And the way this would work is first come, first serve. So after the process is done for non-reserve pilots, let's say this 3-day was offered VDT, Lisa and Mike, unassigned reserves, decide to place a bid on 3 alpha for VDT. This for reserves will be first come, first serve. So for this example, we'll just say that Lisa put in her bid before Mike for this VDT pairing. So she'd be awarded this pairing VDT. And if it is awarded to a reserve, the duty periods that were inside of her original reserve block, in other words, the first 2 days, will pay straight pay. And the duty periods awarded outside of reserve block, that last day would pay double time. Okay, in our last example, we're going to bring together several of the different concepts into one slide, which including VDT. So in this example, we have 3 reserves. In this case, it's 3 3-day reserves. And we have 3 uncovered pairings from open time. 2 3 days, 3 alpha and 3 bravo, and 1 4-day, 4 alpha. So let's take a look at this one. So obviously with this, we have 2 3 days and we have 3 3-day reserves. So that will be no problem for scheduling to cover with the current reserves. They pull the first 2 names off the RCO, Mark and Lisa. Once again, Lisa is senior with a seniority of 1. So her proffer is processed first. She proffered for 3A, then 3B. So she's assigned 3A, which leaves 3B to be assigned to Mark. So at this point, we have 1 4-day, call it pairing 4 Charlie, which is unassigned. They do not have any 4-day reserves. So like mentioned in the last example, scheduling has a couple of options here. They can split to cover 4 Charlie, but only if there are no premium bidders for that pairing. And again, this is a change for Contract 2020 to help mitigate split to cover, which inflates duty periods and leads to more reserve utilization. So in this example, we're going to assume there were no premium bidders for 4 Charlie, and 4 Charlie was offered in VDT. In this case, again, it will go out to VDT for all of the pilots. If it is not awarded to a non-reserve pilot during that VDT process, it can be awarded first come, first serve to a reserve in that category. So Mark and Lisa were assigned in the first part of the RPP process. Brad was not. So he, and this is optional, but if he likes, he can put a proffer for 4 Charlie for VDT. And again, be awarded first to non-reserve pilots. If there are none, it'll go first come, first serve to reserve pilots. Since he's a 3-day reserve, the first 3 duty periods of 4 Charlie would be paid straight, and the last duty period would be paid double time. Okay, now that we've gone through several examples of how the reserve proffer process will work, one other note. New in contract 2020, reserve pilots will be able to sign up for reserve proffer alerts. These alerts will be similar to open time alerts in that reserve pilots can go in and set the parameters for pairings they're looking for example, report time, release time, that sort of thing. And then if a pairing is in open time that meets those parameters, the reserve pilot will be sent an alert, and that pilot can decide whether they want to place a proffer for that pairing. Again, these reserve proffer alerts will be optional to the pilot. They will not be sent out for the 0900 dot close, just like today. We don't get open time alerts for the 0900 dot close. That will be the same rule set for the reserve proffer alerts. But this allows pilots to know, hey, something has dropped into open time. I'd like to put an alert on that, or maybe even change their fly pass preference.